The iron collar had rubbed her neck raw 3 days ago, and now the wound wept a thin yellow fluid that smelled like copper pennies left in rainwater. Lyra pressed her spine against the wooden slats of the holding pen, feeling every splinter through the threadbare linen they had given her to wear, and tried to keep her breathing shallow because deep breaths made the twins shift, and when the twins shifted, they howled, not out loud. Not yet. They howled in her blood, in the marrow of her bones, a low vibration that made her teeth ache and her vision blur silver at the edges. She did not understand the language they spoke. She only knew it was old, far older than any pack tongue she had learned in her 23 years of life, and that when they howled like this, the other slaves in the pen went quiet and pressed themselves into the far corner, their wolves whimpering behind their eyes. The Greymarch slave market opened at dawn, and dawn was coming. She could smell it, the way the frost on the auction stage began to melt and release the scent of old pine sap and cattle dung that had been trampled into the boards over decades of commerce. Commerce in bodies. Commerce in wolves too broken or too poor to fight for territory. She was lot number 47. The handler, a squat man with a port wine birthmark that covered the left side of his face like a map of some ruined country, had told her she would sell cheap. Pregnant Omega, no documented bloodline, no pack sigil branded on her shoulder to prove origin. The only reason she was worth anything at all was her age. Young enough to work another 20 years if they fed her properly, which her current condition suggested no one had bothered to do. Her ribs showed through the linen. Her collarbones jutted like the edges of broken shelves. Her hair, which had once been dark and heavy enough to braid into a rope, had thinned until it hung around her face in uneven curtains, and there were patches near her temples where it had fallen out entirely, the way hair does when a body begins to cannibalize itself to keep a pregnancy alive. The twins were taking everything she had, and they were giving back something she could not name, something that hummed beneath her skin like a second pulse, something that made the iron collar grow warm against her throat at odd hours. She had stopped trying to understand it. Understanding required energy, and energy required food, and the last food she had eaten was a heel of millet bread 4 days ago, stolen from a slop bucket meant for the handler's dogs. The dogs had gotten to eat the rest. She had gotten a kick in the ribs for the theft, which was still blooming purple and green across her left side, shaped roughly like the toe of a man's boot. Around her, the other slaves stirred. There were 11 of them in this pen, a mix of Omegas and a few Betas who had been captured from disbanded packs along the northern border. The war had made refugees of thousands. The market was well stocked this season. A girl no older than 15 sat across from Lyra, hugging her knees. Her name was Dessa, and she had not spoken a single word since they had been loaded into the transport wagon 6 days ago. But she watched Lyra's belly with a kind of desperate fascination, the way someone might watch a fire when they are freezing, wanting to get closer but afraid of what it might do. The pen gate rattled. The handler appeared with his ledger and a tin cup of water that he set inside the gate without entering, the way you might slide food into a cage at a menagerie. 1 cup, 11 people. Nobody moved for a moment. Then a beta male with a missing ear lurched forward and grabbed it, tilting it back and swallowing 3/4 of it in 2 gulps. Water ran down his chin and into the matted fur of his collar. He set the cup down with a hollow clang, looked around with eyes that dared anyone to challenge him, and retreated. Lyra did not move. She had learned long ago that fighting for scraps only spent calories she could not afford to lose. But Dessa uncurled herself, crawled to the cup, dipped 2 fingers into the remaining water, and brought them to Lyra's lips. The water tasted like tin and someone else's thirst. Lyra let it sit on her tongue for a moment before swallowing. "Thank you," she whispered. Dessa said nothing. She went back to her corner and resumed watching the belly. The twins shifted again. That bone-deep howl rolled through Lyra's body, and every wolf in the pen flinched. The beta with the missing ear actually whimpered, a sound that seemed to horrify him, and he turned his face to the wall. Outside, the market was waking. Lyra could hear the merchants dragging their stalls into position, the clink of chain being organized by weight and gauge, the lowing of cattle in an adjacent yard. She could hear, farther away, the sound of carriages on frozen ground, the crunch and squeal of iron-rimmed wheels on frost, which meant buyers were arriving. She pressed her hands flat against her belly. The linen was so thin, she could feel the heat of her own skin through it, and beneath that, the answering heat of the twins, which burned hotter than any temperature a normal pregnancy should produce. A healer in the last pack that had held her, before they sold her to the border traders, had pressed a palm to her stomach and then pulled it back as if burned, had looked at her with an expression she could not read. Fear, maybe. Or something worse than fear. Recognition. "What are they?" the healer had asked, and Lyra had not known how to answer because she did not know who their father was. Not in the way that implied carelessness. In the way that implied something had been taken from her memory, scooped out cleanly the way you might core an apple, leaving only the hollow shape of something that had once been there. She remembered a forest, snow on black pines, a scent like wood smoke and crushed juniper berries, the feeling of being held by something so large it had blocked out the stars, and then nothing, waking alone in the snow with her clothes intact and her body already beginning to change, a heat building behind her navel that would not go away. 7 months ago. She had been sold twice since then. The first pack had kept her as a kitchen worker until her belly began to show, and the alpha's wife decided she was an eyesore. The second pack had assessed her market value and decided she was worth more in coin than in labor. And so she had ended up here, in the Grey March market, in a pen that smelled like wet straw and old fear, waiting to be sold to whoever would pay the least for the most work. The gate rattled again. This time the handler entered, and he was not alone. Behind him stood a woman in a trader's leather apron, her silver hair pulled back in a severe braid, her eyes the flat grey of river stones. She carried a measuring rod and a set of iron calipers that she used to assess jaw width, shoulder span, hip diameter. The tools of her trade. "On your feet," the handler said. "All of you. Buyers are walking the floor in 20 minutes. The slaves stood. Some quickly, some slowly. Lyra pulled herself up, using the wall, and the motion sent a wave of dizziness crashing through her so hard that the floor seemed to tilt sideways. She locked her knees. She breathed through her nose. The smell of her own unwashed body reached her, sour and sharp, layered over something else, that strange warm undertone that had been growing stronger for weeks, like honey left in the sun, like amber heated over a flame. The trader woman walked the line, pausing at each slave. She measured, she prodded, she wrote figures in a small leather notebook. When she reached Lyra, she stopped. "How far along?" 7 months, Lyra said. "Maybe more." The trader pressed 2 fingers beneath Lyra's jaw, checking the glands. Her touch was clinical, neither gentle nor cruel, and her fingers were cold. She moved her hand down to Lyra's belly and held it there. Something in her expression changed. Not much. A flicker of the nostrils, a slight widening of the pupils. "Twins," the trader said. It was not a question. Lyra nodded. The trader removed her hand, wrote something in her notebook, and moved on without another word. But Lyra noticed that she wiped her palm on her apron afterward, quickly, the way you might wipe away something that had stung you. The 20 minutes passed like water draining from a cracked vessel. Too fast. Not fast enough. The slaves were led out of the pen single file, chained at the ankle with enough slack to walk but not enough to run, and marched up a narrow ramp to the auction stage, which was open to the sky and bordered on 3 sides by tiered wooden benches already filling with buyers. The cold hit Lyra like a wall. Winter in the northern territories was not a season, but an assault, and the wind that swept across the stage carried ice crystals that stung her exposed arms and face. Her feet, bare on the frozen boards, went numb almost immediately. She could feel the twins react to the temperature drop, their heat flaring higher. That hum in her blood rising to a pitch that made her vision swim. The benches held perhaps 200 buyers. Pack representatives, most of them, betas and gammas, sent with purses to purchase labor for spring planting and construction. A few independent traders looking for house servants. And in the back row, a cluster of figures in dark cloaks who did not speak to one another, and whose stillness had the particular quality of people who are accustomed to being feared. Lyra did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the boards beneath her feet, watching the frost melt where her skin touched wood. Tiny circles of warmth that should not have been possible, given how cold she felt everywhere else. The auctioneer took his position at the front of the stage. He was a tall man, with a voice built for carrying over crowds, and he began the morning's business with the efficiency of long practice, moving through the first lots quickly. The beta with the missing ear sold for 12 silver marks to a mining operation. A pair of Omega sisters went for 20 marks, combined to a textile workshop. Dessa, the silent girl, was purchased by an elderly woman who ran a boarding house near the Western Pass and who paid 8 marks without haggling, which suggested she wanted the girl for something other than labor. Lyra tried not to think about what, lot by lot, the pen emptied. Lot by lot, Lyra's number approached. She could feel her heartbeat in the collar wound, a sick throb that kept time with the auctioneer's patter. And then, as lot 43 was led forward, a heavy wool blanket draped over its owner's bare shoulders by a handler who seemed briefly, unexpectedly embarrassed by the man's nakedness, something changed in the air. Lyra felt it before she heard it. A pressure, atmospheric, like the minutes before a thunderstorm, when the sky goes green and the birds stop singing. The twins went still inside her, absolutely still, for the first time in months. Their constant hum, cut out like a candle flame, pinched between 2 fingers, and in the silence it left behind, Lyra heard her own heartbeat for the first time in weeks without their frequency woven through it. Then they screamed, not howled. Screamed. A sound that had no sound, that existed only in the frequency of blood and bone and something deeper than both, something that lived in the architecture of her marrow and the spiral of her cells. The scream ripped through her so violently that her knees buckled, and she went down hard on the frozen boards, her belly striking first. And for one terrible second, she thought she had killed them both, that the silence and then the scream had been the last spasm of 2 lives ending. But the scream did not stop. It changed. It became a word. A single word in a language she had never learned but understood now, with the clarity of a bell struck in an empty cathedral. Father. The auction stopped. Every wolf on those benches felt it. Lyra could see it in the way their bodies jerked, the way conversations died mid-sentence, the way 200 sets of eyes turned toward her crumpled form on the stage with expressions that ranged from confusion to alarm to something approaching terror. And from the back row, from the cluster of cloaked figures who had not moved or spoken since they arrived, a sound rose. It began as a growl, subsonic, felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. It vibrated through the wooden benches, through the frozen boards, through the iron chains and the frost, and the very air itself. It climbed in pitch and volume, with the patience of something enormous being roused from sleep, something that had been still because it chose to be still, not because it lacked the power to move. The cloaked figure in the center stood. He was tall enough that, standing among seated men, his shadow fell across the entire stage. The cloak fell away from his shoulders as he moved, and beneath it was black armor, not ceremonial, scarred and dented in patterns that told a story of wars survived. His hair was dark, cut short at the sides, longer on top where it fell across a forehead marked with a single pale scar that ran from his left temple to the bridge of his nose. His jaw was the kind of jaw that looked like it had been designed to take punishment and return it with interest. His eyes were amber, not golden, not brown. Amber, the deep burnt orange of tree resin with something trapped inside it. And they were fixed on Lyra with an intensity that felt like a physical force, like standing in a current of water too strong to resist. The growl that had been building in his chest broke free. He roared. It was not a sound a human throat should have been able to produce. It was not a sound most alpha throats could have produced. It came from somewhere beneath language, beneath instinct, from the bedrock of what it meant to be wolf, and it hit the auction crowd like a wave, staggering some, dropping others to their knees, sending the weaker wolves into immediate submission. Their necks bared, their eyes averted, their wolves rolling belly up inside their chests. The auctioneer stumbled back from his podium. His ledger hit the ground. His mouth moved, but no words came out, because the roar had taken all the available air and soul and sound and claimed it. Silence followed, the kind of silence that has weight. The Alpha King descended from the benches. He did not hurry. He walked with the measured pace of someone who understood that the world would wait for him because it had no choice. His boots on the frozen ground made a sound like something inevitable approaching. The crowd parted without being asked. Bodies moved out of his path, the way water moves around a stone, instinctively, physically, with the kind of deference that lives below conscious thought. He reached the stage. He did not use the ramp. He placed one hand on the edge of the platform, which was chest height, and lifted himself up in a single motion, his armor barely shifting, the muscles in his forearms standing out like cables beneath scarred skin. The handler with the port wine birthmark was standing between the Alpha King and Lyra. He lasted 3 seconds. His wolf broke before the man did, and he scrambled backward, tripping over a chain, falling, crawling off the far side of the stage without looking back. The Alpha King knelt. He knelt the way a mountain might lower itself, slowly, deliberately, as if the act required the rearrangement of natural law. His knees touched the frozen boards, 2 feet from where Lyra lay crumpled on her side, her arms wrapped around her belly, her breath coming in thin, rapid clouds in the cold air. He was close enough now that she could smell him. Cedar bark and iron, and something beneath both. Something wild and ancient, like the air inside a cave that had never been opened, like the first breath of a forest after lightning strikes. The scent hit her brain and detonated something, some locked door she had not known existed. and behind it was a cascade of recognition so powerful it felt like falling. She knew that scent, not from memory, from deeper than memory, from the place where the twins lived, from the frequency they had been humming in for 7 months, from the language they spoke that she had never understood until this moment. The Alpha King raised one hand. His fingers were broad, scarred across the knuckles, the nails cut short and blunt. He held the hand in the space between them, palm up, an offering rather than a command. His amber eyes had changed. The predatory focus was still there, but layered over it was something else, something raw and barely controlled, the expression of a man who has just found something he had given up looking for. "Who did this to you?" His voice was low, rough, as if the roar had scraped his throat raw on its way out. It was not a question pitched upward. It was a sentence that expected an answer the way gravity expects objects to fall. Lyra opened her mouth, closed it. The twins were vibrating again, but the frequency had changed. It was not a howl or a scream now. It was a purr. A deep, rolling, contented purr that resonated through her bones and made the iron collar grow so hot it began to singe the inflamed skin beneath it. The Alpha King's gaze dropped to the collar. His jaw tightened. A muscle in his temple jumped. Once, twice, the only external sign of whatever was happening behind those amber eyes. He reached out and closed his hand around the iron band. The metal groaned. It did not break cleanly the way it would have in a story. It deformed first, folding inward under the pressure of his grip, and Lyra felt the moment when it pinched her skin harder before it gave way. A bright, hot line of pain that was immediately replaced by cool air on a wound that had not breathed in weeks. He set the ruined collar on the boards beside her. His hand remained in the air near her throat, not touching, hovering, and his fingers trembled. She could see that. The Alpha King's fingers trembled. No one on those benches breathed. Lyra looked up at him. His face was very close, close enough that she could see the texture of the scar across his temple. Not smooth, but ridged, layered, the kind of scar that comes from a wound that healed and reopened and healed again. Close enough that she could see his pupils dilate as their eyes met, the amber shrinking to a thin ring around expanding black. The twins purred louder. The boards beneath them began to vibrate with it. "Mine," the Alpha King said. The word came out involuntary, dragged from some depth below his conscious control, and the moment he said it, something shifted in the air. Something intangible, but absolute, as if a contract had been signed in a language older than written law. He caught himself. The rawness in his expression shuttered, replaced by something more controlled, more kingly, though the tremor in his hand did not stop. "What is your name?" he said. "Lyra." Lyra. He said it as if tasting it, testing its weight against something inside him. "Lyra." "Can you stand?" "I do not know." He did not wait for her to try. He gathered her off the frozen boards, the way you might gather something made of paper and light, one arm beneath her knees, the other behind her shoulders, her belly pressed against his chest plate, which should have been cold metal, but was warm, impossibly warm, as if the armor drew heat from his body, the way some metals draw lightning from the sky. Her weight, what little there was of it, settled against him, and he adjusted without effort, standing from his kneel with a motion that did not jostle her. Her head fell against his shoulder. She was too weak and too stunned to hold it upright, and his shoulder was broad enough that it cradled her skull like a shelf built specifically for this purpose. The scent of him was everywhere now. Cedar bark and iron, and that deep underground something. The twins had stopped purring and were simply radiating heat, a steady furnace warmth that pulsed in time with the Alpha King's heartbeat, which she could feel through his armor, slow and heavy and certain. The auctioneer had retrieved his ledger. He stood at the edge of the stage with the expression of a man trying to decide between professional obligation and survival instinct. Professional obligation won, barely. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice cracking on the second syllable. "Lot 47 has not yet been formally offered. The opening bid was set at... How much?" The auctioneer blinked. The opening... How much? For all of them. The auctioneer's mouth worked. All of the lots? "There are still 6. I said all of them." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The auctioneer looked at his ledger, looked at the 6 remaining slaves chained at the ankle along the back of the stage, looked at the 200 buyers on the benches, none of whom had made a sound or moved a muscle since the roar. 70 marks would cover the remaining lots, Your Majesty. That is generous. My steward will pay you 100. Unchain them. All of them. Now." The auctioneer moved with a speed that suggested he had suddenly become very motivated. Chains fell. Iron hit wood. 6 slaves stood blinking in the winter light, unchained for the first time in weeks, their expressions ranging from disbelief to a cautious, feral hope. The Alpha King turned, Lyra in his arms, the ruined collar on the boards behind him, 200 wolves watching in the kind of silence that would become a story told in market towns for decades. He walked to the edge of the stage and stepped down, that same single controlled motion, and the crowd parted again, and his cloaked companions fell into formation around him without a word or a signal, and they moved through the Grey March market like a dark current through still water. Lyra, pressed against his chest, felt the cold begin to recede. Not because the air had warmed, because the twins had recognized something in the Alpha King's heartbeat and had matched their frequency to it, and the resonance between the 3 of them, father and children, and the body that carried them, was generating a heat that turned the frost on her lashes to water, and the water to steam that rose from her skin like something being forged. She did not understand what was happening. She did not understand who he was, beyond the title, beyond the roar, beyond the amber eyes. She did not understand why the twins knew his heartbeat, or why his scent unlocked rooms in her memory that she could not enter. But she understood, with a clarity that required no translation, that she was not going to be sold again. The Alpha King's entourage consisted of 7 wolves in dark cloaks and a single uncloaked woman who walked at the front of the group with a posture that suggested she was accustomed to being the first person to encounter trouble. She was tall, lean, her hair cropped close to her skull, and she carried a sword at each hip with the casual comfort of someone who slept with weapons within reach. When the Alpha King emerged from the market with Lyra in his arms, the woman did not question, did not stare, did not ask. She simply adjusted her pace and her position to account for something the king was carrying that he did not intend to put down. They moved through the market district and into the town proper, past stone buildings with shuttered windows and chimneys breathing grey smoke, past a blacksmith whose hammer stalled mid-swing when he saw the procession, past a bakery whose front door stood open and released the smell of rye bread into the frozen air, a smell so vivid and specific that Lyra's stomach clenched with a violence that made her gasp. The Alpha King looked down at her. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable, but his arms tightened fractionally around her body. "When did you last eat?" he said. She could not remember the exact day. She remembered the bread, the millet heel, the dog bucket. She remembered the boot in her ribs for taking it. Days, she said. 4. Maybe 5. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Something older than anger. Something with teeth. He stopped walking. The entourage stopped with him instantly. The kind of synchronization that comes from years of moving together. "Sarah," he said. The tall woman with 2 swords appeared at his side. "Your Majesty, find food, not rations. Bread, broth. Something her body will not reject." Sarah looked at Lara for the first time. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of ice in shadow, and they moved over Lyra's body with the efficient assessment of someone trained to evaluate physical condition in battlefield triage. Her gaze lingered on the collar wound, the visible ribs, the distended belly, the bare feet on frozen ground. "You should not be alive," Sarah said, and it was not said with cruelty. It was said with the flat precision of someone stating a medical fact. "She is alive," the Alpha King said. "Feed her." Sarah disappeared into the bakery. She returned 3 minutes later with a clay bowl of broth that steamed in the cold air, and a piece of white bread torn into small pieces. She held the bowl up to the king, who looked at it, looked at Lyra, and made a decision that required a degree of vulnerability Lyra suspected he did not display often. He sat down on the stone steps of the bakery, in full view of the street, in full view of his entourage, with the woman he had just carried out of a slave market, cradled in his lap like something newborn, and he held the bowl to her lips. Slowly, he said, "Small sips. Your stomach has forgotten how to work." She sipped. The broth was chicken, salted, with a thread of rosemary that bloomed in the back of her throat like a memory of warmth. Her stomach seized at the first swallow, a cramp so sharp her eyes watered, and then relaxed and accepted, and wanted more with a desperation that was close to violence. He paced her. Every time she tried to drink too quickly, he tilted the bowl away, just slightly, just enough to slow her down. His other arm remained around her shoulders, supporting her upright, and his hand was spread across her upper back, fingers spanning the ridges of her spine, each vertebra distinct and countable through the thin linen. The bread he fed her in fragments, one piece at a time, placed between her lips with fingers that could have crushed the iron collar, but held the bread as if it were made of something that might dissolve at the wrong pressure. The street around them was silent. Merchants stood in doorways. A child pressed its face to a frost-webbed window and watched with the uncomplicated fascination of someone too young to understand power dynamics. One of the cloaked wolves, a young man with red hair and the nervous energy of someone who had recently been promoted beyond his comfort level, shifted his weight and cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, we should... The carriages are at the north gate, and if we mean to reach the Thornhold before, we will leave when she has finished eating," the Alpha King said without looking up. "And not before." The red-haired wolf closed his mouth and resumed his position. Lyra finished the broth. She ate every piece of bread. When it was done, the cramps in her stomach had eased to a dull ache, and the world had stabilized around her in a way it had not been stable for weeks. She could think again. She could see clearly. And what she saw, when she looked up at the face of the man holding her, frightened her as deeply as anything in the slave market had, because she recognized him. Not his face, not his name, but the shape of him, the scent of him, the way his heartbeat synchronized with the twins in a pattern that could not be coincidence. He was the missing piece, the hollow in her memory. The forest, the snow, the stars blotted out by something vast. "You," she whispered. His amber eyes met hers. Something in them cracked open, briefly, like ice on a river showing the dark water beneath. "You remember," he said. She shook her head. "I do not remember, but they do." She placed her hand on her belly. The twins pulsed beneath her palm, and she saw the Alpha King's breath catch, a hitch in that controlled rhythm, when the pulse reached him through the place where her body pressed against his. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the crack was sealed, the ice reformed, the king restored. "We will talk," he said, "at Thornhold, when you are safe and fed and warm. There are things I need to tell you, Lyra, things that were taken from both of us, from—" He stood, lifting her with him, and the procession resumed. The Thornhold was not a castle. It was a fortress grown from the mountain itself, its walls cut from the same black granite that formed the peaks above it, so that approaching from a distance, it appeared to be a natural formation, a jagged tooth of rock erupting from the ridgeline. Only as the carriages drew closer did the windows become visible, amber rectangles of warmth set into the dark stone, and the gates, massive iron and timber constructions bearing a crest Lyra did not recognize. A wolf standing upright, one paw resting on a crown, its mouth open in a howl that had been captured in metal and frozen mid-sound. The Alpha King carried her through those gates, through an entrance hall floored in stone, worn smooth by centuries of boots, through corridors lit by oil lamps that cast warm, shifting pools of light on walls hung with tapestries so old their colors had faded to suggestions of what they had once been. Past servants who pressed themselves against walls and bowed their heads, not in fear, but in the particular deference of people who respect their master, because they have seen what he does when he thinks no one is watching. A room had been prepared. Whether it had been prepared before they arrived or in the frantic minutes between the gate and the upper floors, Lyra could not tell. It was warm. A fire burned in a stone hearth large enough to stand inside, and the bed was wide and deep and covered in furs that looked like they had been chosen for softness rather than display. The floor was covered in rugs of woven wool, dark reds and golds that absorbed sound and cold. There was a copper tub in one corner, already filled with steaming water. He set her on the bed. He stepped back. For the first time since the market, there was distance between them, and in that distance Lyra could feel the mate bond stretch and protest, a physical sensation, a rubber band pulled taut across the space between their bodies. He felt it too. She could see it in the way his hands clenched at his sides. "My healer will come to examine you," he said. "Sarah will bring clothes. You are safe here. No one enters this room without your permission." He turned toward the door. "Wait," Lyra said. The word came out raw, cracked, the voice of someone who had not used it for anything other than answering questions in weeks. He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. She watched the muscles in his back shift beneath the black armor, watched his shoulders rise and fall with a single controlled breath. And then he turned. "Your name," she said. "I do not know your name." Something moved across his face. Brief, complex. The ghost of a smile that did not quite form, pressed flat by something heavier. "Kael," he said. "Kael Vorstag, Alpha King of the Iron Ridge Pack and Sovereign of the Northern Territories." A pause. The fire popped in the hearth, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. "And your mate," he said. "Whether you claim me or not, whether you remember or not, yours." He left. The door closed behind him with a solid oak and iron finality. And Lyra sat on the bed in a room warmer than any she had occupied in months, possibly years, and pressed both hands to her belly, where the twins had gone silent for the first time since the auction. silent, but not still. They moved beneath her palms, small, deliberate movements, as if settling, as if coming home. The healer was a woman named Bridget, who smelled like dried chamomile, and whose hands were so covered in calluses that they felt like warm bark against Lyra's skin. She was perhaps 60, with white hair braided into a crown on her head, and eyes the deep green of moss on wet stone. She did not bow when she entered. She looked at Lyra with the frank, appraising gaze of someone who had seen worse and helped it heal. "Let me see," she said. And it was neither a request nor a command, but something in between, an invitation that carried the weight of authority earned through decades of competence. Lyra let her see. The collar wound, the boot-shaped bruise, the ribs, the patches of missing hair, the feet, which had been numb for so long that Lyra had stopped thinking about them, and which, now thawing before the fire, were beginning to scream. Bridget examined each wound with hands that were firm, but unhurried. She pressed her palm against Lyra's belly and held it there, and unlike the trader woman at the market, she did not pull away. She closed her eyes, her brow furrowed. "How long have they been doing that?" she said. "The humming?" Lyra asked. "No." Bridget opened her eyes. The shifting. "They are not just moving, girl. They are positioning, like wolves in a formation, facing outward." Lyra did not know what that meant. Bridget seemed to decide it was not a question for tonight. She treated the collar wound with a paste that smelled like pine tar and honey, and the burn of it made Lyra's eyes water. But beneath the burn was a coolness that sank into the inflamed tissue like rain into cracked earth. She bandaged the ribs. She rubbed a salve into Lyra's feet that restored sensation gradually rather than all at once, which was a mercy, because full sensation in frostbitten feet is not a gift, but a punishment. "You need to eat," Bridget said. "Every 3 hours. Small amounts. Your body is in deficit. The twins have been feeding on your reserves for months, and you have nothing left to give them. Another week in that market, and you would have gone into organ failure." She said this in the same tone she might have used to describe the weather. Not cold, just accurate. "The king," Lyra began. Bridget looked at her. Her green eyes held something that might have been pity or might have been understanding, which is a different thing entirely. "The king has not slept in 7 months, Bridget said, "since the night he lost something in the northern forest and could not find it again. Since the night his wolf went mad, and he nearly leveled the Thornhold before they could restrain him. He has had scouts in every territory, in every market, in every border town. He has spent a quarter of the crown's treasury on the search. His council thinks he is losing his mind. His enemies think he is distracted enough to attack." She paused, applied another layer of paste to the collar wound. "He went to the Greymarch market, because a scout reported an unusual energy signature in the slave shipments, energy consistent with royal bloodline wolves. He did not know what he would find there. He did not expect you." Bridget packed her supplies into a leather case that had been repaired so many times its original color was impossible to determine. "Eat," she said. "Sleep. Let the fire do its work. In the morning, things will be clearer. Or they will not. But you will be stronger either way." She left. Sarah arrived minutes later with clothes, real clothes, a loose linen shift and wool leggings, and a robe lined with fur so soft it felt like pressing your hand against a sleeping animal. Lyra changed with difficulty, her body protesting every movement, her bruised ribs screaming at the act of lifting her arms. She ate again. Someone had left a tray by the fire. a bowl of barley porridge sweetened with dried berries, a cup of warmed milk, a small pot of honey. She ate slowly, Bridget's 3-hour instruction echoing in her head, and each bite was a small war between her stomach's desperation and its atrophied capacity. When she finished, she lowered herself onto the bed. The furs received her body like a held breath releasing. The fire crackled and settled. The twins resumed their hum, but quieter now, a frequency that vibrated at the exact pitch of contentment, and Lyra let it carry her into a sleep deeper than any she had known. She woke to the sound of breathing that was not hers. The fire had burned low, its embers painting the room in shades of deep orange and shadow. The breathing was coming from the floor beside the bed. She turned her head slowly and saw him, Kyle, the Alpha King, sitting on the floor with his back against the bed frame, his legs stretched out before him, his head tilted back against the mattress. He had removed his armor. Beneath it, he wore a simple black shirt and trousers, and without the armor, he looked different, not smaller, but more human. The breadth of his shoulders still enormous, but less fortress and more flesh. He was not asleep. His amber eyes were open, fixed on the far wall, and in the dim light they seemed to glow with their own internal source, like embers set into bone. She should have been afraid. A king, an Alpha King, sitting on her floor in the dark while she slept. But the twins had not reacted to his presence with alarm. They were purring again, that deep, resonant frequency, and the bond between their bodies hummed in the narrow space between the bed and the floor, where he sat like a wire, strung taut and vibrating. "How long have you been there?" she asked. He did not startle. He may have known she was awake. 3 hours, maybe 4. "You should sleep. I will. When I know you are safe." "I am in your fortress," she said. "Behind your gates, guarded by your wolves." "Yes, then I am safe." He turned his head. In the ember light, the scar across his temple was a line of darker shadow. His eyes found hers, and the amber in them was so deep it was almost red. "You do not understand what is outside these walls," he said. "What took you from me in the northern forest? What erased your memory and scattered you into the trafficking routes like debris in a river? It was not random. It was not bandits. Someone targeted you specifically, Lyra. Someone who knew what you carried before either of us did." The twins shifted. That outward-facing formation Bridget had described, as if even in the womb they were bracing for something. "What am I carrying?" Lyra said. He looked at her belly. His expression held the rawness she had seen on the bakery steps, the crack in the ice, and this time he did not seal it. "My heirs," he said. "The first twin born Alpha in the 4-star line in 400 years. The last time it happened, the twins grew up to reshape the map of the continent. Every pack, every kingdom, every rival bloodline has a reason to want them dead." The ember light shifted. Shadows moved on the walls like living things. "And you," he continued, "you are not an Omega. You were never an Omega. Your wolf is not absent. It was bound, sealed, by someone with enough power to lock a wolf so thoroughly inside its human host that neither one can hear the other." Lyra's breath caught. The information landed not as surprise, but as confirmation, a key turning in a lock she had always felt but never found. "When I touched you at the market," Kyle said, "my wolf could feel yours. Buried deep, deeper than any binding I have encountered, but alive, and furious, and magnificent." He reached up and placed his hand on the edge of the bed, his fingers an inch from hers. "I will find who did this," he said. "I will find who took your memory, and sealed your wolf, and sold you into chains. And when I do, There will not be enough left of them to bury. The fire popped, a log settled, sending a cascade of sparks that illuminated his face for a flickering instant before the room dimmed again. But first, he said, and his voice dropped to something quieter, something almost gentle, a tone that cost him something to produce. First, I need you to eat, to heal, to rest. Everything else comes after that. He withdrew his hand, settled back against the bed frame, closed his eyes. Lyra lay in the dark, listening to his breathing slow, and felt the twins match their rhythm to his, and thought about the word he had used at the market, the word that had come out of him involuntarily, dragged from somewhere beneath conscious control. Mine. She was not ready to answer it, but she was not ready to refuse it either. And in the space between those two positions, in the warmth of the furs and the dying fire, and the presence of a man who had sat on her floor for hours rather than leave her unguarded, she allowed herself something she had not felt in so long. She had forgotten its shape, the possibility that things might be different now. Morning arrived through narrow windows that had been designed more for defense than illumination, but the light that came through was clean and white and carried the particular quality of winter sun on snow. Lyra woke to find the space beside her bed empty, the floor where Kael had sat bearing the impression of his weight in the thick rug. Food waited on the table near the fire. Porridge again, but this time with cream, and beside it a small plate of dried apricots and a wedge of hard cheese. Lyra ate with the disciplined restraint of someone who knows her body is still relearning how to process sustenance. When she finished, Sarah appeared at the door. The tall woman with the two swords looked different in daylight, sharper, more defined, as if the sun revealed edges that the shadow had softened. Her cropped hair was silver blonde, and the pale eyes that had assessed Lyra with battlefield efficiency now held something marginally warmer. "The king requests your presence in the lower hall," Sarah said. "He says to tell you that you are free to refuse. A request, not a command." Lyra noted this. Sarah led her through corridors that smelled like old stone and lamp oil, and, faintly, of something else, a green, alive scent that Lyra could not place until they passed a doorway that opened onto an interior courtyard where, impossibly, a garden grew. Frost covered the leaves and petals, but the plants were alive beneath it, bushes of rosemary and thyme, and something with small blue flowers that Lyra did not recognize, thriving in the thin warmth that radiated from the thorn-holed's heated walls. Sarah noticed her looking. "Bridget's garden," she said. "She grows things that should not survive in this climate. She argues with the cold until it gives up." The lower hall was a large room, with a ceiling supported by stone columns carved to resemble tree trunks, their branches spreading overhead in a canopy of interlocking stone limbs. A fire burned at each end of the room, and between them a long table held maps, ledgers, correspondence in various stages of completion. Several wolves were present, seated or standing, and they fell silent when Lyra entered. Kael stood at the head of the table. In daylight, in his own hall, he was every inch the sovereign. Black armor again, but different from the battle-scarred set he had worn at the market. This was court armor, polished, fitted, bearing the wolf and crown crest in silver at the collar. His amber eyes found her immediately, tracked her across the room with the focused attention of a predator that has identified something it will not lose sight of again. But there was something else in the room that Lyra registered before she reached him. A scent, a familiar scent. And the moment it reached her, the twins reacted, not with the purring warmth they gave Kael, but with a violent, searing heat that blazed through her belly and made her stagger. The scent was jasmine and cold iron, and she knew it. She knew it the way a body knows the shape of the hand that struck it, the way a wound remembers the blade. Seated at the far end of the table, in a chair that seemed designed to keep its occupant both present and contained, was a man. He was slight, fine-boned, with silver hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale and flat and very, very old. He wore chains at his wrists, ornamental in appearance but functional in weight, and his expression when he saw Lyra was complex. Not surprise, not guilt. Something more intricate. Something that looked, for a flickering moment, like grief. This was the man who had sealed her wolf. She knew this with the certainty of the twins' reaction, with the bone-deep recognition that bypassed memory and spoke directly to the body that had been violated by his power. She did not need to remember the forest, the snow, the ritual that had torn her wolf from her conscious reach and locked it in a cage of silence. Her body remembered for her. The room went very still. Kael spoke. His voice carried the controlled precision of a man managing a dangerous situation. "Lyra," he said, "this is Aldrich Vashon, former High Sorcerer of the Pale Court. He was captured by my forces 3 days ago, attempting to cross the eastern border. He has information about what happened to you in the northern forest." Aldrich looked at her. His pale eyes held that complex grief, and beneath it, something unexpected. Relief. "I did not think you would survive," he said. His voice was thin, reedy, the voice of a man whose power had been spent rather than broken. "When I bound your wolf, I expected the strain to kill you within weeks. The pregnancy should not have been possible without the wolf to stabilize the process. The fact that you are standing here is—" He paused, searched for a word. "Unprecedented," he finished. Lyra's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her belly, where the twins burned like 2 coals, their heat radiating through the fabric of her clothes. "Why?" she said. Aldrich looked at Kael, then at the chains on his wrists, then at Lyra. "Because you were not supposed to exist," he said. "The mate bond between a Vorstag Alpha and a Seren bloodline wolf has been forbidden for 6 centuries. Your union would produce offspring powerful enough to destabilize the balance of every pack alliance on the continent. The Pale Court's mandate was to prevent this. When it became clear that the bond had formed, I was sent to sever it." He looked at his hands, turned them over. The calluses on his palms were not from labor, but from channeling, ridged and silvered, the skin too smooth in some places and too rough in others. "I was supposed to kill you," he said. "Both of you. In the forest. I was supposed to make it look like rogues. But I could not." The room held its breath. "I bound your wolf instead," Aldrich continued. "Erased the memory of the bonding. Scattered you into the border traffic where the Pale Court would lose your trail. I told them you were dead. I brought them blood evidence. Hair. Enough to satisfy their tests." He looked up at Lyra, and the grief in his eyes was not for himself. "I had a daughter," he said. "She would have been your age. She died in the border wars when she was 6. I have done terrible things for the Pale Court since then. Things that should have burned whatever humanity I had left. But when I stood over you in the snow, with my hands full of the power to end your life, I saw her face." He swallowed. The chains clinked softly against the table. "I am not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I am telling you why you are alive." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Lyra could feel every wolf in the hall processing the information, adjusting their understanding, recalculating alliances and threats. She could feel Kael's amber gaze on her, intense and watchful, and through the bond she could sense his wolf, massive and barely contained, wanting to tear the man at the table apart, and being held back by something stronger than rage. Strategy. The knowledge that Aldrich alive was worth more than Aldrich dead. "You said Seren bloodline," Lyra said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. The twins seemed to be stabilizing her, feeding her a calm that was not her own. "What does that mean?" Aldrich looked at Kyle. Something passed between them, some prior conversation Lyra had not been part of. Kyle spoke. "Your mother was a wolf from the Seren line, the last line of the first wolves, the original pack, the ones who existed before the bloodlines diverged, and the territories were undrawn. The Seren wolves were thought to be extinct. They were hunted to near destruction 3 centuries ago because their power was considered too dangerous to exist alongside the pack hierarchy." He moved around the table toward her, slowly, as if approaching something that might bolt. "Your wolf is not an Omega's wolf," he said. "It never was. You were raised in obscurity, told you were weak, told you had no wolf. Because someone hid you, someone who knew what you were and wanted to keep you alive long enough for the Seren power to stabilize before it was discovered." He stopped an arm's length from her. His amber eyes searched her face. "When Aldrich bound your wolf," he said, "he did not realize it was already bound. The seal your guardian placed on you in childhood, the one that made you appear wolfless, was so deep that Aldrich's binding only added a second layer. Your wolf has been fighting through 2 bindings for 7 months, and it has been using the twins as conduits to channel its power." He looked at her belly, at the place where his children grew, powered by a wolf so old and so fierce that it had bent the laws of binding rather than submit. "That is why they howl in the bloodline tongue," he said. "They are speaking the language of the first wolves, a language that died with the Seren line, or should have." Lyra felt the weight of this settle into her body, not as understanding, but as resonance, the way a tuning fork vibrates when struck by its matching frequency. Everything she had experienced, the rejection, the hunger, the slavery, the collar, the cold, mapped onto a new framework and became something else entirely. Not random suffering, targeted erasure. She had been hidden so well that she had hidden herself from herself. The twins moved inside her, that outward-facing formation, wolves positioning for defense. They knew, she realized. They had known all along what they were, what she was. They had been trying to tell her in the only language they possessed, the language of the first wolves, the language of the beginning. Kyle was watching her, with an expression that combined several things she was learning to read on his face: protectiveness, fear of losing her, the constant restrained violence of an alpha whose mate is in danger. But there was something new now. Awe. The specific awe of a man who has just realized that the woman he claimed from a slave market in a moment of instinctive possessiveness is something far larger than he anticipated. "You are not afraid of me," she said. It was not quite a question. It was the vocalization of something she expected from everyone who learned the truth about her bloodline. Kyle did not answer immediately. He seemed to be weighing his words, or perhaps weighing his capacity to say them, without undermining the image of control he maintained for the room full of wolves behind him. "My wolf tried to tear down the thorn-hold when it lost you," he said. "My council wanted to sedate me. My enemies sent assassins to test my stability. I have not slept a full night in 7 months. I ate a meal on the steps of a bakery in a slave market town with a woman I had known for 10 minutes because the alternative was watching her starve." He took one step closer. The bond between them tightened. Hummed, vibrated. "No, Lyra, I am not afraid of you. I am afraid of the world that tried to take you from me, and I intend to make it afraid in return." The days that followed were measured not in hours but in meals, in Bridget's treatments, in the slow return of strength to a body that had been depleted past the point of reasonable survival. Lyra ate. She slept. She sat in Bridget's garden, wrapped in furs, and let the thin winter sun reach her face while the herbs breathed their scent into the cold air. Kael was present in a way that defied the demands of kingship. He attended council meetings, but they were held in rooms adjacent to wherever Lyra was, and the door between them was always open. He received intelligence reports from scouts tracking the Pale Court's movements, and he reviewed them at the table in Lyra's room while she ate her meals. He never touched her without permission. He never entered her space without announcing himself. But the bond between them was a constant physical presence, a taut wire of warmth and want that neither of them could ignore. At night, she would sometimes wake to find him on the floor again, his back against her bed frame, his breathing slow and measured, his wolf humming a frequency so low it was more vibration than sound. She stopped asking him to leave. He stopped pretending he would. On the fourth night, she reached down and touched his hair. It was the first time she had voluntarily touched him, and the effect was immediate and seismic. His entire body went rigid. His breath stopped. The wolf inside him surged forward so powerfully that his eyes shifted from amber to molten gold, the pupils stretching vertical for a half-second before he wrestled control back. Her fingers were still in his hair. "Sorry," she whispered, starting to pull away. His hand came up and caught hers, not gripping, holding. His fingers laced through hers, and his thumb pressed against the inside of her wrist where her pulse beat, and he held her hand against the side of his head where his hair met his temple, where the scar ran, and he breathed. "Do not apologize," he said, his voice rougher than she had heard it, thick with the effort of containment. "Do not apologize for touching me. You can touch me whenever you want, wherever you want, as many times as you want, for the rest of your life. And if that is not what you want, if you never want to touch me again, I will sit on this floor until my bones fossilize and count it a blessing." She did not pull her hand away. She let her fingers trace the line of the scar, feeling its ridges, its layered history. And he closed his eyes and leaned into her touch with a surrender so complete it redrew her entire understanding of what strength looked like. They stayed like that for a long time. The fire burned low. The twins purred. On the seventh day, her wolf spoke. It came without warning. Lyra was standing in Bridget's garden, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea, watching the frost patterns on the rosemary leaves, when something deep inside her cracked. Not broke. Cracked, like a shell yielding to the thing growing inside it. The sound it made was not physical, but it was loud, a detonation of silence that rippled outward from her center and shattered something ancient and layered. Two bindings, one laid in childhood, one laid in the forest, falling away like chains cut through by something too hot and too fierce to be contained any longer. Her wolf emerged. Bridget, who was pruning the blue-flowered plant 2 feet away, looked up and froze. Her eyes went wide. Her pruning shears fell from her hands and hit the stone path with a bright, metallic sound that echoed in the courtyard. "Oh," she said. "Oh, child." Lyra could not speak. She was too full of something enormous and wild and ancient that flooded every cell of her body, like water returning to a dry riverbed. Her wolf was not a small thing. It was not a submissive thing. It was vet and silver, and it burned with the light of something that predated the current age, something from the time before pacts and territories and kings, something foundational. Her eyes turned silver, not grey, silver. The colour of moonlight on still water, the colour of the first wolf's eyes in the oldest tapestries, the colour that the Seren line was known for, the colour that had been hunted to extinction. Except it had not been extinct. It had been hiding. Inside a woman who had been told she was nothing, sold for 12 silver marks, fed from dog buckets, wearing an iron collar on a slave market stage. The energy that poured from her was not aggressive. It was not destructive. It was something else entirely. It was restorative. The frost on the rosemary leaves melted. The plants in the garden, already improbably alive, began to grow visibly, putting out new shoots, the blue flowers opening in the thin winter sunlight as if spring had arrived in a single impossible moment. The stone beneath her feet grew warm. The air lost its bite. Brigid's arthritic hands, which Lyra had noticed the old healer rubbed and flexed unconsciously throughout the day, went still. The healer looked at them, turned them over, flexed them experimentally, and then looked at Lyra with an expression that was not quite awe and not quite terror, but lived in the narrow space between the two. The garden bloomed, and in the lower hall, according to what Sarah told Lyra later, the Alpha King stopped mid-sentence in a council meeting, his hand flat on the table, his amber eyes blazing gold, and said a single word, "Mate." Then he ran. He was in the garden in under a minute, having covered the distance from the lower hall through 3 corridors, up a flight of stairs, and through a servant's passage that Sarah later admitted she did not know existed. He emerged through a narrow door in the courtyard wall and stopped. Lyra stood in the center of the blooming garden, her eyes silver, her skin luminous, her wolf radiating from her like heat from a forge. She looked like something from the oldest stories. She looked like what she was, the last daughter of the first wolves, carrying twin heirs to the Iron Ridge throne, standing in a garden that should not have been alive, surrounded by flowers that should not have been blooming, with a wolf inside her that should have been extinct. Kael crossed the garden in 4 strides. He stopped in front of her. He raised his hands to her face, cupping her jaw, his thumbs against her cheekbones, his fingers in her hair, and the contact between them detonated something in the bond that neither of them could have prepared for. The twins screamed their bloodline word again. But this time, it was not father. It was a word that had no direct translation in the common tongue, a word that meant something like completion, or perhaps home, or perhaps finally, and it resonated through both their bodies and out through the garden and into the stone of the thorn-hold and beyond. A pulse that every wolf within 50 miles would feel and remember. Kael pressed his forehead to hers. Their wolves were synchronized now, 2 frequencies that had found their matching pitch, and the sound they made together was something Brigid later described as the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing she had heard in 60 years of living. "I knew," he said, "in the forest, the moment I saw you. I knew what you were, what we would be. And then you were gone, and I thought I had dreamed you." "I was real," she said. "You were real, and you are here, and you are never leaving again." It was not a command. It was a plea. From a king who did not plead. From an alpha whose wolf did not beg. And Lyra, standing in a garden of impossible flowers with her wolf singing inside her for the first time in her life, heard the plea and answered it. "Then stay with me," she said. "Not on the floor. Stay." He kissed her. It was not gentle. Kings who have spent 7 months in private agony do not kiss gently. But it was careful, which is a different thing. The carefulness of enormous power deliberately restrained, of a man who could crush iron, but chose to hold a woman's face as if it were made of light. His mouth on hers tasted like pinon and cold water, and something electric, something that sparked where their lips met and ran down through her body and into the twins, who responded with a surge of heat that made the flowers nearest them open wider, their petals stretching toward the kiss like small living things reaching for the sun. When they parted, Kael's eyes were fully gold. His wolf was so close to the surface that his canines had extended, just slightly, and his pupils were vertical slits in a sea of molten amber. "I will stay," he said, "for as long as you will have me, which, if I have any say in the matter, is forever." In the garden, the blue flowers that Bridget could not identify turned out to be first wolf's breath, a species thought to have died out with the sarin line. They bloomed that afternoon in a profusion of color that would not fade for months. The peace lasted 9 days. On the morning of the 10th day, the scouts came back. 3 of them, riding horses lathered with sweat despite the cold, their faces gray with exhaustion, and something worse. They had been tracking the Pale Court's movements along the eastern border, and what they reported changed the temperature in the Thornhold from sanctuary to war footing in under an hour. The Pale Court was coming. Not with assassins this time, with an army. 3,000 wolves from allied packs who had been promised territory in exchange for their allegiance, led by a woman named Thessaly, who held the title of adjudicator, and who had, according to the scouts, publicly declared Kael's mate bond to a Saren wolf, an act of aggression against the continental balance of power. Their demand was specific. Surrender the Saren woman and the unborn twins for ceremonial severance, a euphemism that the Pale Court used to describe a process that was, according to Aldrich, irreversible and fatal. Or face invasion. Kael received this information in the lower hall. Lyra was beside him, seated in a chair that had appeared at the head of the table at some point during the past week, without anyone commenting on its placement. She wore the clothes Sarah had provided, proper clothes now, not the threadbare linen of the slave market, but wool and leather, and a cloak of dark red that brought out the silver in her eyes. She was still too thin, still bearing the marks of months of deprivation. But her wolf was awake, and the wolf's power was rebuilding her body with a speed that alarmed Bridget and fascinated Sarah, and made the household servants whisper the words. First wolf in the corridors, when they thought no one was listening. Kael did not pace. He did not rage. He stood at the head of the table and looked at the maps and listened to the scouts and asked questions in a voice so level and controlled that anyone who did not know him might have thought he was calm. Lyra knew him now. She could feel the storm behind the calm, the volcanic pressure of an alpha whose mate and children had been threatened, building behind the dam of strategic discipline. His wolf was a physical presence in the room, not shifted, not visible, but pressing against the inside of his skin so hard that the veins in his forearms stood out, and his amber eyes had not returned to anything resembling human normal since the scouts arrived. "How long?" he said. 3 days, the lead scout replied. "Maybe 4. They are moving through the eastern pass, and the snow is slowing them. But they will arrive before the week is out." Kael looked at the map, looked at the eastern pass, marked with the scout's notation, looked at the Thornhold's position on the ridgeline. "How many of our wolves can we field?" Sarah answered. 1,200 within the fortress, another 800 within 2 days' ride if we send word now. After that, allied packs might contribute if we make the argument compelling enough. 2,000 against 3, Kael said. On our ground, Sarah said. With our walls. In winter. We have held worse odds. A silence fell. The kind of silence that precedes decisions from which there is no retreat. Kael looked at Lyra. His amber eyes held a question he did not ask out loud, but the bond carried it. Are you ready for this? Can you endure what comes next? Will you let me fight for you, or will you insist on fighting alongside me because your wolf is ancient and powerful and has been caged for 23 years and wants blood? Lyra held his gaze. The twins moved inside her, that outward-facing formation, wolves positioning for defense. She thought of the slave market, the iron collar, the boot-shaped bruise, the dog bucket, the handler who never entered the pen, the trader who wiped her hand after touching Lyra's belly. Every person who had looked at her and seen something disposable, something cheap, something worth 12 silver marks. And she thought of the garden, the kiss, the flowers, the man who sat on her floor because he could not bear to leave her unguarded. I am not going to be hidden again, she said. Not by you. Not by anyone. Kael's jaw tightened. His wolf pressed harder against his skin. I was not planning to hide you, he said. I was planning to place you on the wall where they can see you. Let them see what they are trying to destroy. Let them decide if they still want to try. The preparations took 2 days. Lyra watched the Thornhold transform from a household to a military installation, its corridors filling with wolves in armor, its walls bristling with archers, its gates reinforced with additional timber and iron. The forge worked through both nights, the clang and hiss of metalwork echoing through the stone like the heartbeat of something being born. Aldrich was brought before Kael in chains and offered a choice: assist in the defense against the court he had served, or remain in his cell and wait for the outcome. He chose to assist, and Lyra saw in his face when he made the choice something she had not expected. Not calculation, not self-preservation, the expression of a man who had been waiting for permission to stand on the right side of something for the first time in decades. He sat with Bridget in her workshop, his chained hands moving over ingredients and equations that Lyra did not understand. And together they constructed something. Wards, barriers, defenses of a kind that were older than pack warfare, drawn from the same era that had produced the Seren wolves, from the age of the first wolves, when power was a relationship between the world and the wolves that walked it, rather than a weapon to be aimed at enemies. On the second night, Lyra found Aldrich alone in the garden. He was sitting on the stone bench near the blue flowers, his chained hands in his lap, his pale eyes fixed on something in the middle distance. The jasmine and cold iron scent that had triggered her twin's reaction at the council table was muted now, diminished, as if the power behind it had been spent, and what remained was residue rather than source. She sat beside him, not close, not far. The distance of 2 people who share a history that neither of them chose. He did not look at her. Your daughter, Lyra said. Aldrich's hands stilled in his lap. Her name was Maren, he said. She had your coloring. Dark hair. She would braid it herself, badly, and refuse to let anyone fix it. She wanted to be a healer, like your Bridget. She could grow things, not with magic, with patience. She would talk to seedlings as if they could understand her, and then act surprised when they grew. His voice did not break. It thinned, like a wire drawn too far. The border war took her in winter, he said. The pack we served could not defend the outer holdings. Her mother had already died. I was in the capital, performing work for the court. By the time I received word, she had been dead for 3 days. He looked at the blue flowers. Their petals were closed against the night cold, furled tight, waiting for morning. I stopped being a person after that, he said. I became a function, a tool. The court points me at problems and I solve them. I solved you, or I tried to. He turned his head and looked at Lyra. His pale eyes were wet, but the tears did not fall. They sat in his eyes like water behind a dam, held back by a control that had become structural, load-bearing, impossible to remove without collapsing everything above it. She looked like this, he said, in the snow, when I stood over you. She looked like my daughter looked when she was sleeping. He turned away. The tears receded. The dam held. I am not asking for forgiveness, he said again. I am telling you why I chose the binding over the killing. It was not mercy. It was weakness. I was too weak to do what I was sent to do, and too much of a coward to refuse the mission entirely. I chose the middle path, and the middle path is where most suffering lives. Lyra sat with this. She did not offer absolution. She did not offer condemnation. She sat with a man who had sealed her wolf and erased her memory, and sold her into a life of chains and hunger. And she held the truth of his grief alongside the truth of his harm, and she did not try to resolve them into something simple, because they were not simple. They were human. After a long silence, she said, "The wards you are building with Bridget, will they hold?" Aldrich looked at his hands again. "Maybe," he said, "if your wolf is what I think it is. If the twins are what I think they are." The Seren power was never about destruction. It was about binding, connection. The first wolves did not conquer territory. They wove it together. Their strength was in the web, not the sword. He looked at her belly, where the twins had gone quiet, listening. "The wards need an anchor," he said. "A wolf old enough and strong enough to hold them. My power is spent. Bridget's is healing, not binding. The king's is vast but wrong in frequency. Alpha power destroys and defends. It does not weave. But yours is the loom itself." He met her eyes. In his pale gaze, she saw the ghost of his daughter. The shadow of the man he had been before the border war took everything that mattered. And she understood that his offer to help was the closest thing he had to atonement. "Show me," she said. The Pale Court's army arrived on the morning of the 3rd day, as the scouts had predicted. Lyra watched their approach from the top of the Thornhold's eastern wall, standing beside Kael, wrapped in a cloak of dark red. Her silver eyes scanning the valley below, where 3,000 wolves poured through the pass like dark water through a funnel. They were organized, disciplined. Their formations held even on the difficult terrain, and at their center, riding a grey horse with the poise of someone accustomed to orchestrating violence from a comfortable distance, was Thessaly. The adjudicator of the Pale Court was not what Lyra had expected. She was small, fine-featured. Her hair was the dark red of dried blood, and she wore no armor, only robes of white and silver that marked her office. She moved through the army with the particular confidence of someone who has never needed to fight, because she has always been surrounded by people willing to fight for her. Thessaly dismounted at the base of the ridge, well within visual range, but outside of bowshot, and addressed the walls in a voice that carried with the clear, projected quality of a trained speaker. "Alpha King, the Pale Court extends its ultimatum. Surrender the Seren anomaly and the unborn bloodline threats. Submit to ceremonial severance. Withdraw your claim to the unsanctioned mate bond. These terms are not negotiable. Compliance will be met with the court's continued recognition of your sovereignty over the Iron Ridge territories. Defiance will be met with dissolution of your line and redistribution of your lands. Her voice was pleasant, almost musical. The voice of someone delivering a business proposal rather than a death sentence. Kael stood on the wall with his hands on the stone parapet, his amber eyes fixed on the small woman below. His wolf pressed so hard against his skin that Lyra could see the shift rippling beneath, fur and muscle, and something enormous trying to tear free from the man-shaped container that held it. He did not roar this time. He spoke, and his voice carried across the valley with the natural authority of an alpha whose power did not need volume to be felt. "I am going to say this once," he said, "and I am going to use small words, so there is no confusion." He placed his hand on Lyra's back, not a gesture of possession, a gesture of presence. "This woman is my mate," he said. "She carries my heirs. She is the last daughter of the Seren line. She is not an anomaly, not a threat, and not a commodity to be surrendered." He leaned forward, just slightly, and his amber eyes found Thessaly's across the distance between them. "You will leave," he said, "or you will be destroyed. There is no third option." Thessaly's expression did not change. She tilted her head the way a bird does when assessing something below it, and raised one hand. Behind her, 3,000 wolves shifted into attack formation with the synchronized precision of a machine. "Then we are at war," she said. The battle began at midday. The first wave hit the eastern wall like a fist of fangs and fury, wolves shifting mid-charge, their human forms exploding into beasts that scrambled up the rocky incline toward the gates. Kael's defenders met them with arrows and oil, and the brutal close-quarters combat of wolves fighting for their home. Lyra was not on the wall when the fighting started. Kael had positioned her in the inner courtyard, surrounded by a guard of Sera and 4 of his most trusted wolves, near the center of the ward matrix that she and Aldrich and Brigid had spent 2 days constructing. The wards were invisible to the eye, but tangible to the wolf, a web of power anchored to the thorn-holed stone and woven through the earth beneath it, connected at its core to Lyra's wolf. She could feel the battle through the web. Every impact against the walls vibrated through the wards and into her body. Every wolf that fell, attacker or defender, sent a pulse of severed connection through the network, like a plucked string. The sensation was overwhelming, not painful but immense. The consciousness of 2,000 living beings simultaneously, their fear and their fury, and the primal simplicity of wolves defending and attacking. The twins were awake, more than awake. They were active, participating, their frequency woven into the wards in a way that Aldrich had not predicted and could not explain. They were not defending. They were communicating. Their bloodline tongue, the language of the first wolves, pulsed through the ward network and into the defending wolves, and Lyra felt, through the web, the effect it had on them. Strength, not supernatural strength. Something older. The memory of what wolves had been before packs and politics and kings. The memory of running together, not as an army but as a family, and the ferocity that came from protecting something that mattered. The defenders held. The first wave broke against the walls and retreated, leaving bodies and blood on the frozen ground. The second wave brought sorcerers. They came in a cluster behind the main assault, 5 robed figures whose power felt like cold water poured into the ward network, a creeping numbness that began at the edges and worked inward. Lyra felt it as a physical sensation, a freezing that started in her fingers and toes and began to climb. Aldrich appeared beside her. He had been released from his chains for the battle, a decision that had cost Kyle something politically and personally. But the sorcerer's value was undeniable. His face was pale, drawn, his silver hair hanging lank around his features, but his pale eyes were alert. "They are trying to unravel the wards from below," he said. "The Pale Court trains its sorcerers in severance magic, cutting connections. But your wards are not connections. They are the connection. The Seren power does not create bonds. It is the bond." He looked at her with an expression that she was learning to recognize as his version of urgency. "You need to push back," he said. "Not with force, with presence. Let your wolf fill the web. All of it. Every thread, every anchor point. Make the wards indistinguishable from yourself." Lyra did not fully understand what he was asking, but her wolf did. The silver wolf inside her, the ancient Seren beast that had been caged for 23 years, rose, not with violence, with expansion. Like water released from a dam, it flowed into the ward network, filling every channel, every junction, every anchor point, until the web was not a separate structure, but an extension of her body, her wolf, her will. The Pale Court sorcerers hit the wards and bounced. Lyra felt it as a recoil, a shock of contact that ran through her entire being and sent the 5 sorcerers stumbling backward, 2 of them falling, their concentration shattered by the force of impact against something they had not expected. On the wall, Kyle fought. She could feel him through the bond, the heat and violence of the Alpha King in full combat. His wolf, and his human form alternating with a fluidity that most wolves could never achieve. He was not the largest wolf on the battlefield, but he was the most terrifying. His wolf was black, pure black, the absence of color, and it moved through the Pale Court soldiers with the precise, devastating efficiency of something designed by evolution for exactly this purpose. But the army was large, and for every wolf that fell, another took its place. The Thornhold's defenders were outnumbered, and the mathematics of attrition did not care about courage or ancient bloodlines. The third wave breached the eastern gate. Lyra felt it through the wards, a tearing sensation, the network convulsing as wolves poured through the broken gate and into the fortress. The inner courtyard was now exposed, and between the breach and Lyra's position stood only Sarah and her 4 guards. Sarah drew both swords. The steel sang against the scabbards, and the sound cut through the chaos with a clarity that was almost musical. "Stay behind me," Sarah said, "and if any of them get past me, which they will not, you run." Lyra did not intend to run. She could feel her wolf responding to the threat, not with fear, but with something vast and implacable. The defensive fury of a mother whose children are in danger. The primal imperative that predates strategy and civilization, and even thought. The first attackers came through the courtyard gate in wolf form. 3 of them, grey and brown and fast. Sarah met them with 2 swords and a fighting style that Lyra would later learn had been developed specifically for single combatants facing multiple wolves, a spinning, circular technique that kept all opponents at blade distance and punished anyone who tried to close. 2 of the 3 went down. The third got past. It came at Lyra with its jaws wide, eyes glazed with battle fury, and Lyra placed her hands on her belly and let the twins respond. The sound that came from her was not a howl. It was a word. The same word the twins had screamed at the auction, but different, directed, focused, carrying the full weight of the Seren wolf behind it. The word hit the attacking wolf like a wall of sound and intent, and the wolf, a beta from a northern pack whose name Lyra would never learn, stopped mid-leap. Its body hit the ground and slid to a stop at her feet. Not dead, not injured. Stopped, as if every muscle in its body had received a simultaneous command to cease, delivered in a language that its deepest wolf instincts could not disobey. The first wolf language was not a weapon. It was an authority. The authority of the original pack, the pack that had existed before all others, the pack whose word was law, because law had not yet been separated from the wolves who spoke it. Lyra looked down at the frozen wolf at her feet. It looked up at her, with eyes that had gone from battle fury to something she recognized. Not submission, recognition. The wolf inside this stranger's body knew what she was. Knew it the way all wolves knew it. Somewhere beneath training and alliance and the politics of pack membership, she was the loom, the web, the thing that connected all wolves to each other, back through the generations, back to the beginning. She was first. Across the battlefield, the effect radiated outward. Not a command, not a compulsion, a reminder. Every wolf that the Seren word reached felt it. The memory of unity. The original bond that connected all wolves before the bloodlines diverged and the packs went to war with each other. Some stopped fighting. Some did not. But enough hesitated, enough paused, enough questioned the orders they had been given by a court that had tried to sever the very connection that made them wolves. The Pale Court's advance stalled, and through the breach, covered in blood and fury, the Alpha King came. He had shifted back to human form, and Lyra could see why. He needed his hands. He needed to hold the sword he had taken from a fallen enemy, a massive thing that he wielded one-handed, and he needed his other hand free because he was dragging something behind him. Thessaly, the adjudicator of the Pale Court, was not injured. She was not bound. She was simply being moved. One of Kael's massive hands wrapped around her forearm, pulling her through the breach and into the courtyard, with the casual force of a man relocating furniture. Her white and silver robes were stained with mud and blood that was not her own, and her face had lost its pleasant composure. She looked, for the first time, afraid. But not only afraid, Lyra saw it as Thessaly was brought before her. Behind the fear, behind the calculation, behind the political mask of a woman who had orchestrated the potential genocide of a bloodline from a comfortable distance, was something else. Fatigue. The deep, structural exhaustion of a person who has been performing a role for so long that the performance has consumed the person underneath. Thessaly looked at Lyra, at her silver eyes, at the belly where the twins hummed their ancient tongue, at the frozen wolf at her feet, stopped by a single word, and the fear in her eyes shifted. "So it is true," Thessaly said. Her voice had lost its projection. It was small now, human. The Seren line lives. She looked at Kael, then back at Lyra, and something in her expression crumbled. "I told them it was extinct," she whispered. 20 years ago, when the last confirmed Seren wolf was killed in the Eastern Territories, I told the court it was over, that the threat was resolved, that we could stop hunting. I recommended the closure of the Seren file. I recommended we focus our resources elsewhere. Her eyes were wet, not with the calculated tears of a politician, but with the raw, exhausted tears of a woman who had fought a bureaucratic war she believed in and lost. "They overruled me," she said, "the senior adjudicators. They said extermination protocols remain active until confirmed biological certainty. 0 living specimens. 0 viable genetic material. They have been hunting a dead bloodline for 2 decades, and I have been the instrument of that hunt. And every year I file my reports, and every year I recommend closure, and every year they say continue. She looked at Lyra with an expression that was not hatred, and was not sympathy, but was exhaustion. The exhaustion of a person who has been complicit in something she knows is wrong, because she believed compliance was the only path to ending it. I did not want this, Thessaly said. But wanting does not matter when the court gives an order. Kael released her arm. She did not run. She stood in the courtyard of the thorn hold, surrounded by wolves who had been trying to kill each other minutes ago, and she waited for judgment with the posture of a woman who had been waiting for judgment for a very long time. Call them off, Kael said. Thessaly looked at the battlefield beyond the breach. The sounds of combat continued. Diminished. The Seren word was still resonating through the ward network, and more wolves were stopping, lowering their weapons, their wolves responding to an authority older than their orders. I cannot, Thessaly said. The court's command supersedes mine in matters of extermination protocol. If I order a retreat, they will replace me and send someone who will not. Then what? Kael said, and the word was heavy with the weight of a king who has run out of patience. Thessaly looked at Lyra. Dissolve the court's authority, she said. The Seren wolves were the original lawmakers. The Pale Court derives its mandate from a charter granted by the last Seren Council 6 centuries ago. If a living Seren wolf revokes that charter, the court's legal authority ceases to exist. The army's orders become unauthorized. The hunt ends. She paused, not because she needed to, but because the weight of what she was suggesting required a moment of structural support. You are the last Seren, she said to Lyra. You have the authority. Speak the word. End this. Lyra looked at Kael. His amber eyes were burning. His body coiled with barely restrained violence, blood streaking his armor, a cut above his eye bleeding freely. He wanted to end this with force. His wolf demanded it. The alpha in him screamed for the simple, satisfying conclusion of tearing his enemies apart. But he looked at Lyra and waited, because the decision was not his to make. Lyra placed her hands on her belly. The twins responded instantly, their frequency rising, their ancient language filling her mouth with words she had never learned, but knew with the certainty of bone and blood. She spoke. The word was not dramatic. It was not a roar or a scream or a battle cry. It was quiet, spoken in a normal voice, in a language that had not been heard on this continent for 6 centuries. It carried the authority of the first wolves and the weight of the original charter, and the simple, devastating power of a legal document being invalidated by its author. The effect was immediate. Every wolf on the battlefield felt it. The Pale Court's authority, which had been a constant, invisible pressure in the background of pack politics for centuries, the gravitational field of a power so established that no one questioned its existence, simply ceased. Wolves looked at each other, lowered weapons, stepped back from enemies who, seconds ago, they had been trying to kill because a court had told them to. The orders were still in their ears, but the authority behind the orders was gone, and without authority, orders are just words. On the battlefield, 3,000 wolves stopped fighting. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic, synchronized moment. In the messy, gradual, confused way that real cessation happens, with some wolves stopping immediately and others taking longer, and a few continuing to fight out of momentum until they realized no one was fighting back. Thessaly sank to her knees, not in submission, in relief. The structural exhaustion that Lyra had seen in her eyes broke through the surface, and the adjudicator of a court that no longer existed put her face in her muddy hands and breathed. Kyle wolf slowly, incrementally, released its pressure against his skin. His amber eyes dimmed to something approaching their normal color. He looked at the battlefield, at the stopped wolves, at the kneeling adjudicator, at Lyra. "Is it done?" he said. Lyra felt the ward network settling, the resonance fading, the twins' frequency returning to their baseline purr. The Seren word she had spoken lingered in the air like the last vibration of a struck bell, and in its fading she could feel the shape of a new world, one without the Pale Court's mandate, one where the Seren bloodline was not hunted, but present, not extinct, but continuing. "It is done," she said. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the first true snow of deep winter was falling, Lyra stood in the great hall of the Thornhold and let the Alpha King mark her. The hall was full. Every wolf of the Iron Ridge pack was present, along with representatives from 12 allied packs and a handful of former Pale Court wolves who had chosen to remain at the Thornhold after the disbanding. Brigid stood near the front, her healed hands folded before her, her green eyes bright. Sarah stood at Kyle's right, both swords sheathed, her face holding an expression that anyone who did not know her might mistake for stoicism, but which was, in fact, pride. Aldrich stood at the back of the hall near the door, as if uncertain whether he belonged. He wore no chains. Kyle had removed them the day after the battle, not with ceremony, but with a pair of bolt cutters and a nod that carried the weight of a conditional pardon. Aldrich had not left the Thornhold. He spent his days in Brigid's garden, tending the blue flowers, talking to them in the thin, reedy voice of a man who had lost his daughter and found, in the unlikely soil of an enemy's fortress, something worth growing. Lyra wore a dress of deep blue, a color that Sarah had chosen because it matched the first wolf's breath flowers, and because, as Sarah had noted with characteristic directness, it made Lyra's silver eyes look like weapons. Her hair had begun to grow back, dark and thick, and Brigid had trimmed it into a shape that framed her face rather than obscured it. She was still thin, but the angles of her body were softening, the ribs retreating beneath new flesh, the hollows filling. The twins were enormous inside her now, 8 months along, and they had been quiet all morning with the particular patient stillness of things that are waiting for the right moment. Kyle stood before her in the black armor with the wolf and crown crest, and he was every inch the Alpha King, the sovereign, the most feared wolf on the continent. But his amber eyes, when they found hers, held nothing of the king. Only the man. Only the plea he had made in the garden, the forever he had offered on the floor of her bedroom, the careful hands that had fed her bread, one fragment at a time, on the steps of a bakery. "Do you accept this bond?" he said. The question was ritual, formulaic, part of the marking ceremony that had been performed in pack culture for millennia. But the way he asked it was not formulaic. It was the way a man asks a question when the answer has the power to determine whether the rest of his life has meaning. Lyra looked at him, at the scar across his temple, at the amber eyes, at the hands that had crushed an iron collar and trembled touching her face. "I accept," she said. He kissed her. Then, with the ancient precision of a wolf claiming its mate, he lowered his mouth to the curve where her neck met her shoulder and bit. The mark went deep. It hurt, a bright, sharp, specific pain that bloomed where his teeth broke skin and spread outward through the bond, through the ward network, that still hummed faintly in the stones of the thornhold, through the twins who screamed their bloodline word one final time, the word that meant completion, or home, or finally. The pain transformed as it spread, not diminishing, but changing, becoming something else, the physical signature of a connection that was now permanent, written in scar tissue and blood, and the frequency of two wolves whose harmony was older than the territory they stood on. When he raised his head, his mouth was stained with her blood, and his eyes were gold, and his wolf was singing. The hall erupted, not with applause, with howls. 500 wolves, Iron Ridge and allied, former enemies and long-time friends, tilted their heads back and howled in the old way, the way that preceded language, the way that meant we are pack, we are together, we are one. The sound filled the thornhold. It filled the valley beyond. It rolled across the northern territories and into the mountains and up into the winter sky, where the snow fell through it and was changed by it, each flake carrying the vibration, the memory, the promise. Lyra felt the mark settle into her skin. It would scar. It would stay. A permanent record of the moment when a woman who had been sold for 12 silver marks and worn an iron collar and eaten from dog buckets and been told she was nothing, stood in the great hall of a fortress and became something that could never be taken away. Not a queen, though that title would come. Not a Luna, though the pack would call her that. Mate. In the old tongue. In the original language. In the word that meant the other half of me. Kyle pressed his forehead to hers. His breath was warm against her face, still carrying the copper scent of her blood. Mine, he said. And then, because the word mattered to him, because it was the first thing he had ever said to her, and because it was true in a way that transcended possession, yours. The twins chose that moment to move, not the positioning, not the outward-facing formation. A kick. Twin kicks, synchronized, hard enough that Lyra gasped, and Kyle pulled back and looked down at her belly with an expression of wonder so unguarded that every wolf in the hall who saw it would remember it for the rest of their lives. The Alpha King, the most feared wolf on the continent, placed both hands on his mate's belly and felt his children kick for the first time. And the sound he made was not a roar, and not a growl, and not any of the sounds that power and violence had trained into his throat. He laughed. It was a small, startled, slightly broken sound. The laugh of a man who has not laughed in 7 months, and whose face has forgotten the shape of it. And it cracked open something in the hall that strategy and ceremony could not reach. Sarah looked away, but not before Lyra saw her wipe her eye with the back of her sword hand. Bridget smiled, the slow, satisfied smile of a woman who has spent 60 years healing broken things and still finds it miraculous when they mend. Even Aldrich, at the back of the hall, standing near the door with one hand on the frame, as if ready to leave at any moment, even he closed his eyes and breathed, and let something in his chest unclench for the first time since a winter morning when his daughter was 6 years old. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the fire burned. And Lyra, standing in the great hall of the Thornhold, with the Alpha King's mark on her neck, and his hands on her belly, and his laugh still echoing in the stone, felt the twins settle into a hum so deep and so contented that it resonated through the entire fortress. Kael's fingers spread across the curve where his children grew, his scarred knuckles brushing the fabric of her blue dress. He did not lift his head. He did not perform for the hall. He stood with his forehead against hers and his hands on their children, and he breathed in the scent of cedar bark and iron and honey warmed by the sun. The scent of their bond, the scent of home. The twins purred. The snow fell. The wolves howled, and in Bridget's garden, the first wolf's breath flowers opened their blue petals to the winter sky, blooming in defiance of the cold, as they would bloom for years to come, long after the stories were told, long after the songs were written, growing in impossible soil, fed by impossible warmth, refusing, as all stubborn and beautiful things do, to be anything other than alive.